It's been a few weeks now since I made my first video on why I believe in the Pretrib Rapture. A lot of things have happened in the world since then, and that has even affected us here. And so I had to kind of put it on the back burner, but I wanted to take a few minutes today and give the second installment concerning this issue and this subject of why I believe that the Pretrib Rapture is the biblical position. And today I want to deal with the origin of the Pretrib Rapture belief, the origin of dispensationalism. Now, me being a dispensationalist and a pre-tribulationist, naturally you're going to know that I'm going to teach and believe that it originated in the Word of God. It's a biblical teaching. However, we need to look at the questions and the criticisms of non-dispensationalists, pre-tribulationists, as to their arguments as to where the pre-tribulational teaching originated. Now, many, if not most, that I have come in contact with or heard teach and preach on the subject that are not dispensational, non-pre-tribulationist, most credit John Nelson Darby as being the originator of the pre-trib doctrine. He's the old Plymouth Brethren preacher from the early 1800s. And many will also bring in a young lady named Margaret MacDonald, who also lived around that time. I believe she was in her teenage years when the supposed influence of her on Mr. Darby took place. And so these two individuals tend to get the credit for the origin of the Pretrib Rapture and even dispensationalism. And the story goes that this young girl named Margaret MacDonald had a vision, gave her vision. Her vision was written down, but that Darby went and visited her church, heard about the vision, and then from her vision, he began to develop his theology of dispensationalism and pre-tribulationism. Now, as sensational as that sounds, and as convincing as it may sound to the non-dispensationalists, the one problem with that is it's absolutely false. It's not true. First and foremost, Darby did visit that congregation, did hear about the vision, and did in fact disagree with what was stated in the vision. It's also been documented that Mr. Darby began to develop his thinking on this subject a full 2 years before the event took place with Margaret MacDonald. I believe her vision took place in 1830, and it was 1827, 1828 when he began to develop his thoughts. In fact, he had an accident and was bedridden for, I believe, over a month, and his sister was caring for him during that time. And during that time, he just gave himself to Bible reading and Bible study, and it's during that time he began to see things that he had never fully seen before, especially a distinction and a difference between Israel and the church. In other words, he began to see a contradiction to the replacement theology that had been so prominent for many, many years within Christendom. And so he did not get his theory from Margaret MacDonald. In fact, I don't have it in front of me, but you can pull it up online. You can read the documentation of the vision that young Margaret had, or said she had. And it was an end times vision, she said. And you can read it. And as you read it, you'll find out, when you actually read it, you find out there's nothing pre-tribulational about her teaching. In fact, it's the opposite of pre-tribulationalism. She literally says that the Antichrist is going to be the test of the church and is going to be used as a purifying element to the church. Go read it. It's online. She was certainly not a pre-tribulationist. Her pastor was not a pre-tribulationist either. And so it's a fanciful story made up. Now these people were associated with each other. They knew each other, but the theory that Darby got his belief system from this young girl who most accused of being demon possessed when this vision was given, well, it's just incorrect. And so I'll say it this way. If you have a pastor or you know of a teacher or you're sitting there listening to a teacher or preacher and they bring up the Darby Margaret MacDonald connection and say that that's where dispensationalism came from and that's where pre-tribulational belief came from, go ahead and mark it down. You're dealing with one of two different possible teachers. They are either, that person you're listening to, teaching or preaching, they're either lazy or they are a liar. And I don't know that there's another category. They're either lazy in the sense that they've chosen not to research the issue themselves. They're just parroting what somebody else said. So they hate dispensationalism, they hate pre-tribulationism. They hear this guy over here they respect say that Margaret MacDonald and her demon-possessed vision was passed along to John Darby, and so that's where it came from, and they're just repeating what they heard. Well, that's laziness. So there's a possibility that the person you listen to is just lazy. The other possibility is they're just dishonest. They're a liar. They know Margaret MacDonald did not teach a preacher of rapture. They know that John Darby disagreed with what she said, her vision stated. They know that it was 2 years prior that Darby began to see what he saw. They know this, but instead they like to go ahead and state that it came from Margaret MacDonald. Okay, well now you're dealing with a liar. So you're either listening to a lazy teacher or a lying teacher. It's one of the two. I can't think of any other options. Now, Darby is credited by many as being the father of dispensationalism. I want to give credit where credit is due. Darby was very influential. But Darby did not or is not the founder of dispensationalism. I have a book here, and I'm not getting anything out of this. I don't know the author of this book. His name's William Watson. But he wrote a book a few years ago called Dispensationalism Before Darby. And all of his quotations and notes and everything in this book are prior to the discovery of John Darby, basically from the 1700s and on back to the early church. And what he does is he shows how dispensationalism has actually been around since the early church. Now, were there always a system of dispensationalism as we see today? Not necessarily. However, what we do see is the pieces of the puzzle down through the centuries. This preacher would see this teacher would see this teacher would see this, and many of them would see some of the same stuff, and many would see the same stuff over here. And where I give Darby credit is he began to take a lot of the pieces that were already there, and many already put together, and he began to put more pieces together. And not just Darby, but many others in the 1800s began to put a lot of the pieces to the puzzle together. There's a development, if you will, of this theology down through the centuries. And that doesn't bother me. And the reason why that doesn't bother me is because, well, basically, prophecy is very difficult. Prophecy is a very difficult subject to deal with. There are no such things as prophecy experts. There may be teachers out there who want to be called prophecy experts, and there may be men who have spent more time dealing with prophecy than they have any other subject. There's no such thing. There is no such thing as a prophecy expert. It is a very difficult doctrine to deal with. It's extremely difficult. I mean, think about it. You have, in church history, you have postmillennialists and all of their little factions. You have amillennialism and all of their little divisions. No postmillennialist is in total agreement with another. All amillennialists are not all in agreement with each other. And then you have premillennialism. I'm a premillennialist, obviously. And just think within my group, premillennialism, you've got dispensationalism, you've got pretribulationalism, which would be dispensational. You've got partial rapture, you've got mid-trib rapture, you've got pre-wrath rapture, you've got post-trib rapture. You say, how can we have so many differing opinions on this subject of prophecy? Because it's hard. It's difficult. And if you find someone out there who says it's easy and talks like it's easy and acts like it's easy, I've got it all figured out, you know they're not a very good Bible student. Because the more you spend time in God's Word, the more difficult you know prophecy really is. In fact, a lot of it will not really fully be understood until we actually see the events take place. Prophecy is very difficult. And what men have done down through the years is they've put pieces to the puzzle together. You see very early in church history, you see a man over here who has a pre-trib position. Over here, a man who is premillennial, but not pre-trib. And you see all these differing pieces of the puzzle. At home, at my house, we have a 1,000-piece puzzle that we started a while back. And I was sitting there with some of them. We were putting some of the pieces, get tiny little pieces together. And I also noticed that sometimes you can put two pieces together and they look like they fit. But then after a while, you find out, oh, these two don't fit. I need to find another place for this piece and that piece. And that's basically what's happened down through church history, is men are putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And there was a volcanic eruption of this in the 16 and 1700s as men began to study the Bible even more and realized that the allegorical method that had dominated the writings of the church leaders down through the centuries was a faulty position, that the premillennial position was the best position, the literal interpretation was the best interpretation. And so that began to be realized, and so the pieces of the puzzle began to be put together. And Darby did a good job of putting more of the pieces of the puzzle together, but he's not the only one. There were others that came along in the 1800s, and the timing is about the time that you see the allegorical method being pushed away and the literal method being brought in. Therefore, these things were seen. And so, from a non-dispensationalist point of view, you may say, hey, it looks like that doctrine started in the 1830s. Well, no, it just really began to really be organized because at that time of the early 1800s, the vast majority of Christendom was leaving allegorical, going into literal, and started pulling the pieces together. Now, not all of the pieces that Darby put together fit appropriately. We've had to make adjustments since then. Not all of the ones that Larkin or Schofield put together fit perfectly. And even since then, we've had to make dispensations, have had to make adjustments. Because prophecy is hard. It's very difficult. And this is a big old book with a whole lot of prophecy in it. It's very difficult. And so that's essentially what has taken place down through church history. It didn't start with Darby. It certainly didn't start with Margaret MacDonald. It's been a difficult process down through church history. If you don't believe it, just read the histories of the church. Read the doctrinal positions of the early church writers. Very few of them agreed on anything. And so there was such a disagreement, even in the writings of the early church leaders, that a lot of people put a lot of stock in, and there was a lot of disagreement. And so, because it's very difficult. Prophecy is very, very difficult. And so I just wanted to touch base on that and explain the origin, if you will, of pre-tribulationism. But I want to finish with this. The non-dispensationalist, non-pre-tribulational opponents, they They hate dispensationalism. They despise pre-tribulationism. Many of them, I've listened to many of them say things like, Darby got his teaching from a demon-possessed teenage girl named Margaret MacDonald. They accuse her of being demon-possessed. I have no problem with that accusation. She is having a weird vision, a vision that I think is unscriptural. So it makes sense to me that she was demon-possessed when she gave this vision. That's fine. But then you read what she said. Now, these non-dispensational, non-pre-tribulational teachers are accusing her of being demon-possessed. Well, then go read what she said. She does not teach a pre-trib rapture. She teaches something that looks a whole lot like the pre-wrath rapture or a post-trib rapture. Now, if you're going to accuse her of being if you're going to accuse her of being demon-possessed, which is fine, now point out the doctrine that she's teaching, because that would be a demon-possessed doctrine, a demonically influenced doctrine. You read what she says, she's not pre-trib. She's more pre-wrath, post-trib. With that being said, if these teachers are right, she's demon-possessed, a demon gave her teaching, will these same men who accuse her of being demon-possessed, will those same men accuse the pre-wrath and the post-trib position of being demon-possessed or demonically influenced teaching as well? I'm not saying the men that teach that doctrine is demon-possessed, but you actually read what she says. She's not pre-tribulational. She's pre-wrathian. She's post-trib. And so with that understanding, are you willing, after you find out what she actually says, are you willing to say that Margaret MacDonald was teaching from a demon-influenced position and condition, the pre-wrath rapture and the post-trib rapture? I doubt they're going to be able to do that. I doubt they're willing to do that. But if she's demon-possessed, if she taught pre-wrath, post-trib, you do the math. You know what that means. Now, I'm not accusing. I'm just saying, if they're right, she's demon-possessed, then what's been accused of the pre-trib rapture all these years of being originating with a demon-possessed teenage girl, then you actually read what she says. You have to reverse what you say and say, well, the pre-wrath position and the post-trib position was taught by a demon-possessed girl. You're going to have to, because that's what she taught. All righty? So just a little thought on the origins of the pre-trib rapture. It did not come from Darby. It's actually always been here. I recommend reading this book, Dispensationalism Before Darby. It's not an easy read. You're going to like the subject. It's kind of a dry read, but it's very informational, instructive, to help you understand. And a lot of this we already knew, but this gentleman just put it in a book and compiled it and did a good job. Dispensationalism has been around a long time. I'm convinced it was an apostolic doctrine. It's been around a long time. Did not begin with Darby, but Darby needs to be credited. He did put a lot of the pieces together and did it well. And many men down through the years have been doing the same as Darby, putting more pieces together, backing up, like this piece out, it didn't fit, let's put that in, and putting the pieces together. We're still doing that, but I believe we're about at the place where we have a pretty good, solid working of balanced biblical dispensationalism. So, hope today's video was a blessing to you.